So good evening. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to review the work of the Code of Conduct Committee. Again, good evening to our superintendent, Fox Alder, the cabinet, our Board of Education trustees. On behalf of our committee, I'd like to highlight how our work has resulted in the proposed revisions tonight based on review of education law and state guidance, but as importantly, in response to our district ideals that recognize that all members of our district community should experience dignity, fairness, and a culture of care. So over the next 3 slides, I'll review the laws and guidance that informed our work. In fact, as you can see, the Code of Conduct Committee itself is required by education law, and it is to include the broad constituency of members who you'll see on the left. This diversity of stakeholders is required, as you'll see on the right, to consider the effectiveness, the fairness, the consistency, and the response to our code of conduct. In addition to the education law that requires us to convene and review the code of conduct, ESSA, or the Federal Elementary and Secondary Schools Act, required states to review safety and disciplinary procedures. In response, New York State formed the Safe Schools Task Force. After significant study, the task force provided 6 recommendations to New York schools to reduce disparities and reform school discipline. In summary, they are to minimize school removals, especially in lower grades, and you'll see that reflected in our work, to address disproportionality in behavioral data, to use data to reduce these disparities, to focus on representative hiring, to shift punitive practices to proactive behavioral approaches, and to provide purposeful professional development to support proactive approaches, including SEL, social emotional learning, PBIS, positive behavior intervention and supports, and restorative practices that Dr. Lopez will expand upon during her presentation. These recommendations were synthesized into 2 main focus areas in the 2023 guidance from New York State Attorney General James and New York State Education Department Commissioner Betty Rosa. I'll review them shortly. I'm going to actually also feature one of our MBK fellows, Aiden Mendez, who in a brief excerpt from his TED Talk, I think illustrated the need to look at disaggregated data and disproportionately very eloquently. So one of 4 recommendations made in this 2023 guidance, again, one of the 4, was to look at behavioral approaches. It mandated districts to implement discipline policies and practices to design and be implemented in a non-discriminatory way to ensure that all students have an equal educational opportunity. And this is based on student discipline data from the U.S. Department of Education that saw this disproportionality involves or reflects elevated levels among students of color, particularly Black students, and students with learning differences, likely attributable to implicit and systematic biases. Secondly, the second guidance was schools should expand efforts to train personnel on developmentally appropriate restorative alternatives. And again, I will expand on some of that, and Dr. Lopez as well. So now it is my privilege to share with you some of the most important professional development we had from our own
We can see
students.
so many of the different types of statistics that we look at today that represent Black and brown students, adults of many different kinds of relationships and households. We can look at higher incarceration rates. We can look at higher dropout rates. We look at higher poverty rates. All of the things that define our people for what? To be labeled as failures. One of the things that severely perpetuates this level of failure in the school system for students of color is the zero tolerance policy, which essentially leaves students such as students of color, low-income students, students with disabilities, and LGBT students and the margin of people where as soon as something happens, as soon as you make the most minuscule of mistakes, there is no room left to grow from it. Especially when it's any kind of physical violence, there is no room left to learn. It is only punishment and failure. We can see that without the zero tolerance policy standard, Black students are already double as likely to be suspended for whatever mistakes that they may be doing. But along with the zero tolerance policy, it only perpetuates the statistic. There is no benefit to this.
So I want to just give it up for Aiden, again, in his very first TED Talk, really beautifully articulating the school to prison pipeline, looking at, and again, I'll illustrate that that's national data, but as we'll look at also, we see some similar, not quite as elevated, but similar trends in our own district data. So, just make sure. As we move to the next slide, these two main categories that are outlined in the 2023 guidance from Attorney General James and Commissioner Rosa really framed the two categories of our focus areas as we looked at, as we informed our work over the course of the year. And they were, again, for districts to implement non-discriminatory discipline policies and practices in response to the U.S. Department of Education research. And number two, to expand our efforts to train school staff in restorative practices. And as you'll see in the coming slides, these two recommendations become the two overarching categories that focused our work. In order to respond to focus area one that asked us to ensure our discipline policies are non-discriminatory in design and implementation, and here you can see that is our focus. We've reviewed at every meeting disaggregated behavioral data. And again, looking at the national trends, we looked at with specific attention to our male, Black, and students with learning and behavioral differences. We engaged in professional development and looking at our data, we engaged in corresponding professional development. Based on the trends that we uncovered in looking at our own data. That included the rights of classified students and the increase and exploring the increase in behavior referrals for Black females, again, in our own data. Most importantly, however, after reflecting on our disaggregated behavioral data, we explored alternatives to suspension to reverse the trends among disproportionately affected groups. After exploring data that said a shared understanding of disproportionality, we turned our attention to focus area two, restorative alternatives to punitive punishment to address this disproportionality. So as you can see here, the real work is where the rubber hits the road is we finalized the minor form that is used to document level one, or in other words, classroom managed behaviors, or the first level of behavior. The minor form encourages teachers to identify the time and the location to reveal patterns of behavior. It also provides an opportunity for educators to identify strategies they use to de-escalate behavior before, during, and after an incident. Secondly, as you can see, we also continue to evolve the progressive behavior intervention and support rubric that clearly identifies levels of behavior, as well as corresponding supports. What are strategies we're putting into place? What is consistent communication we're putting into place, in addition to any disciplinary responses that may follow. And this is, again, to support consistency and the fair implementation of the code of conduct, as well as to set a restorative approach. Thirdly, and finally, we refined the implementation of the rubric. So I did presentations, either I or representatives from our committee did at least two presentations last year. We did one kind of understanding setting where we introduced it. And then throughout the year, we also looked at school-specific case studies to calibrate our use of the rubric. We also use that opportunity to gather feedback from educators to refine both the rubric and the minor form. An example of our adjustments is we actually divided the minor forms into an early elementary and upper elementary form because educators found that it was too cumbersome to use with behaviors listed that weren't relevant to their students. After reflecting on the recommendations of the Safe School Task Force and the corresponding 2023 state guidance, our data review, work on the minor form and rubric, we also reflected it would be critical to review the language of the Code of Conduct. Additionally, we've reflected on the essential question posed by our superintendent, challenging us to review if our policies and procedures are impeding the equity we seek. In our subcommittee, we reflected while policies can impede equity we seek, that conversely, we could advance restorative and equitable practices through shifting the language of the policy. Accordingly, moving from the language of zero tolerance to the spirit of restorative practices that seeks to keep our community whole by proactively teaching necessary skills and repairing the community when skills are forgotten or not demonstrated. So while the proposed revisions have been available to the public for 30 days, mainly the revisions fall under about 5 major themes or categories. Really a purposeful alignment with district vision and beliefs. Number 2, integration and definition of restorative practices. Number 3, alignment of language and procedures with the progressive behavior intervention and support rubric as really the driver of our restorative practices. Number 4, revising gendered language and practices. And number 5, revising criminalizing language, shifting away, and we'll cover that more later. But instead of talking about students as disruptive, we get more descriptive of behavior that interferes with teaching and learning. And while we'll look briefly at examples of shifts in language in each category, it's also important to highlight the revisions based on careful review. Stephanie Roebuck and I from Keenan Bean went through every word of the Code of Conduct, and she made some important recommendations as a result. Importantly, we linked the acceptable use and remote learning policy to make it clear that the Code of Conduct applies during remote learning and vice versa. We also included the Surgeon General advice about technology for students under 13. We linked student use of the internet-enabled device policy that was just passed that Owen referred to earlier. And importantly, we defined that demographic data must be collected in regard to the enforcement of the internet-enabled device policy, and that no suspensions can be employed as a result of not following the policy. Including, again, being specific in the inclusion of language based on recent case law and SED guidance, as illustrated in the last 4 points about inclusion of specific weapons, updating the language about detention, procedures for in-school suspension, and again, identifying that only school employees can provide behavioral consequences. Returning to our revisions based on the categories that we identified, our main focus was to infuse the Code of Conduct with our district vision and commitment to restorative practices by including, for example, the district mission statement and the value and definition of restorative practices. As we transition to the next slide that looks at how alignment between this philosophy and alignment and the actual alignment to practice, I'd like to read the introduction to the rubric drafted by the Code of Conduct Committee. We recognize the effectiveness of restorative approaches and other progressive disciplinary measures that build positive relationships. These interventions are a shift away from harsh and punitive disciplinary responses. Instead, they educate students about the harm caused by their actions while seeking to reunite them with the school community. And I think that's so important because, again, this was drafted by representatives of every school that included educators and administrators alike. So in order to realize this introductory statement of the rubric, we also aligned the code of conduct with the language and procedures of the rubric. Specifically, we included guidance and descriptions of the levels of progressive behavior, interventions and support rubric. We changed expectations for student behavior to align with the levels and the descriptions of each level. And we referenced the rubric as the system for all procedures with corresponding detail throughout the code. Additional to the revisions to the code of conduct we developed was to address discrimination and gendered language or practices, as you'll see in the next slide. Some examples were, again, changing language that was gendered as far as him or herself to themselves. We also identified that our dress code was not was gendered. We also realized that there was a need to provide some linking to DASA practices and definition. So that's included in this category as well. Similarly, to respond to learning that criminalizing language and practices feed the school to prison pipeline, we were dedicated to address and revise criminalizing language and practices. For example, as I think I mentioned earlier, we shifted everywhere where students were described as disruptive to describing the behavior that was being displayed. For example, substantially interfering with teaching and learning. We also were very specific in changing language that is criminalizing, for example, by violation, aggressor, perpetrator. We also just changed many titles throughout to include more restorative language. And essentially, I believe that the board received an executive summary that gave a more detailed view of the changes to the code of conduct, and that the changes to the proposed edits have been available to the public for 30 days. But essentially, my copy of the slide is not up there, but I would just like to recognize, in addition to the whole committee, LaToya Langley, who really spearheaded this work. And when she began it, or when at the beginning of our work together, I remember her showing the definition of the word discipline, and it being a derivative of the of Latin word discere, which means the foundation, and again, is the root for discipline, with instruction, teaching, learning, or knowledge, or also meaning a pupil, student, or follower, and that the essence of our code of conduct and the proposed revisions are really to ensure that we're driving learning and social emotional learning for our students, and that, again, we're seeking restorative practices that make our community whole and whole together as learners.